Hi, my name is Malik Barrymore, and I am an intern with the Prince Mohammad bin Fahd program. Today I'm here with Dr. Roger Handberg, who is a political science teacher here at UCF. Dr. Handberg has previously worked as the director for the Center for Space Policy and Law and was the director for the Institute of Behavioral Sciences. Dr. Handberg, thank you for joining us today.
I'm pleased to be here.
So we're going to go into our first question. How has the Middle East historically been tied to American space policy?
Well, it starts back in the early beginning, although the Middle Eastern nations were not necessarily directly involved. But NASA has a commitment in its basic legislation that is to engage in international activities. And so that started out being mostly European and Japanese. But by the 1980s, for example, a Saudi prince flew on a shuttle mission. And the United States has allowed various what we might call experiments that were built to fly on shuttle missions. Now some similar kind of things are sent to the International Space Station, of which the UCF is the major partner and de facto leader because it's this one who initiated construction of the International Space Station back in the 1980s, but then it was Space Station Freedom, and it's gone through a variety of iterations, but now it's considered as the International Space Station.
Wow. So you did mention that a Saudi prince did go into space.
Yeah, he flew on a shuttle mission. At that time, NASA did not have a space station built, so they developed a program where they allowed individuals who were not astronauts to fly. Saudi prince was one. Senator Nelson over in Florida, who's in Congress, flew as a congressman. He had to train for like 2 years while doing his duty as a congressman at that time. And then there was a U.S. senator from Utah who also flew. And then you had the tragic thing where Christy McAuliffe, who was the teacher in space, which was an extension of that kind of program, died when the Challenger blew up in 1986. But her successor, Barbara, did actually fly and basically do the mission that Christina would have done if she had not been killed.
Wow. And switching more to modern times, does the investment of $1 billion by Saudi Arabia into Virgin Galactic affect our own privatized space race today?
It doesn't really affect it, at least in the short term. Virgin Galactic started in 2004. There was a prize offered at that time, and they were the first ones to do it's not Virgin Galactic at that time, but it's a private program, and they got bought by what became Virgin Galactic. The difficulty has been they flew in 2004. They said that they would be flying suborbital missions, carrying passengers and payloads by the mid-2000s, but we're now 13 years later, and they haven't done the second mission yet. They had an accident where someone was killed. But what is happening, as I assume, is that they need additional funding to keep going because Virgin Galactic has been funded basically without any incoming funding, any kind of profits or anything that would pay back the cost of the operation. So the Saudis are making an investment. It gets them in on the ground floor, but it's very typical of how the Gulf state nations have participated in space. They have actually mostly done it as investors. The Gulf state nations, led by Saudi Arabia, became involved in an early what we call ArabSat program. It was a communications satellite program that was regional. At the time they did that, that was unusual. Only the Canadians had one and the Europeans, because at that time all of the communication satellites across the world, at least not that were not Soviet Union programs, were owned and operated by what was called Intelsat, the International Telecommunications Satellite Corporation. That was an international monopoly that was set up, and what it did was it provided services to underdeveloped states at a discount. Any state could join if they wished, but none of the Soviet related states did. So it was basically a Western, what would have been in that time period called a Western alliance. But it did allow countries that were underdeveloped like India and others to at least get some access to space communications. But the satellites themselves were built by the Americans and they were launched by the Americans. So it was an American monopoly, but others were allowed to get in. What the Gulf states did, led by Saudi Arabia, was get the opportunity to split off and form a satellite network that would service the Middle East and not the whole world. You know, and that carries on today. Al Jazeera flies on those, for example. It's how all those communication satellites operate. And so the Arab states have had a strong presence in that sense of subsidizing programs that they then benefit from economically and socially.
And then also we have other regional satellite programs being set up, like of course in Europe with the EU and India and China. How does that affect the overall monopoly that the U.S. previously had on satellite services?
Well, the U.S. has lost its monopoly. That happened actually starting in the 1980s when the Challenger blew up in 1986. That ended the U.S. monopoly over launches of commercial satellites in the West. People began to fly in different things. The end of the Cold War truly ended the U.S. monopoly because now you could fly your satellite if you were able to build one or buy one. You would fly it on. You could fly it on a Russian launcher or a Chinese launcher or whoever else had a launch system. The Europeans had built their Ariane system that went operational in the mid-1970s, and so it was well in place when Challenger blew up, and then the U.S. was forced to go back to what they call legacy launchers, the Delta and the Atlas. But those were too expensive compared to other countries, and they were all, at that time, inefficient. Those went through a developmental period in the 90s and improved, but they still, the United States has lost its launch monopoly, which is where SpaceX becomes important because it has become surging and becoming clearly the dominant launcher in the commercial sector.
So I have taken one of your classes before, and in some of your lectures, you've written about the difficulty of advocating and justifying manned space missions. Do you think that this will change with the emergence of new national space agencies in the Middle East?
Yes, it will, but it'd still be a prestige thing. Now, the reality is human space flight is now increasingly going to be dominated by commercial vendors. SpaceX is building the Dragon to take people to the International Space Station. And if you're able to put another space station up, a commercial one or some kind of commercial facility, they provide the option of how to get there, as Boeing is building its Starliner, which will be another way to get to low Earth orbit with humans and return them, hopefully safely. So the U.S. monopoly that it had over, individual space flight is long gone. And so the question for the Arab states is going to be, is it worth the cost? Now, if SpaceX and others are able to develop a tourism aspect to it, then they would be an obvious source of customers, assuming you can meet the physical parameters of what's necessary. Even as a passenger in a spacecraft that goes to space where there's no gravity, microgravity, you're going to have to be able to meet certain kinds of physical requirements. Because if something happens, it's going to happen very quickly, and we need you to be able to move and take care of yourself. So this will not be cripples going to space in the sense of people who lack the strength that you can be handicapped and be in space because gravity is gone. So that limitation is there, but you're still going to have to be able to manipulate and move yourself around into doing things.
Because we have seen the effects of microgravity on astronauts that have been in space for long durations of time.
Right, and I think that's the thing that's the showstopper from going to Mars. The problem is when you get to Mars, it may be a one-way trip because you may not survive either the radiation dangers, microgravity. We're discovering, or it's becoming obvious, for example, for relatively short periods of time in space on the International Space Station, your vision is affected. It's one we didn't expect.
And speaking of Mars, does the planned mission to Mars by the UAE act as a more direct push for space than previously seen in the Middle East? And can we call this the emergence of a new space actor for this version of the space race?
That's a tough one to answer in a sense, because many countries have said they're going to send a person to space. The difficulty is doing it. Now, I think the United Arab Emirates has one advantage in that it understands that it's probably not going to build the rockets and the hardware. They're going to purchase rides. That's a realistic goal. But will that significantly impact the space race, or whatever you want to call it, the competition in outer space? I don't think so, only because I don't see them as having the ability to sustain a major push, unless they're talking about moving their population to space and becoming a space civilization. Well, the difficulty is, as we've just mentioned before, you will die, or you will be so enfeebled that if you return to Earth, you won't be able to survive. I mean, when the astronauts and cosmonauts return from space, and Taigonauts for the Chinese case, you notice they all sit in chairs when they're done, because they have to, even for that short period, they need to rehabilitate themselves. Doesn't mean they're crippled, but there's a weakness. Now, if you do this for people for long periods of time, we don't know what that means. It may be that they won't be able to function very well in Earth gravity.
And recently we've seen the place that the Gulf states are taking in this new age of space technology is with satellites. Is there another facet in this industry that they are filling?
I think they are starting to understand that they need to do some space science things, because the space science things can have the ability to develop technologies and skills. What's going to happen for the Gulf states primarily, or the Arab states, is going to be they're going to have to develop a cadre of trained, professionally knowledgeable people. If you do that, that means that you can start doing different things related to space, which are actually going to space. Singapore, for example, has a very active space effort, but they don't send anybody to space. What they do is they build technologies, they figure out ways to use existing space technologies to do things better. So what you see is a opportunity for them to break the dependence on fossil fuel. For example, they're all oil states. Oil is going to run out. Now, when it runs out is unclear, but everyone knows that it's going to run out. Now, the Saudis will probably be the last to have theirs run out, but the other states are already starting to have wells that are running dry, or they're starting to have saltwater intrusion, which means that they pumped out the oil. So they're going to have those issues going forward. So they're going to have to come up with an alternative. Saudi Arabia sees the same pressures. They've got a little more of a cushion in terms of what they're doing, but the new Saudi king and his son, the crown prince, are at least in principle trying to move Saudi Arabia into these other kinds of technologies. Plus, it has another virtue. If you are able to develop a skill base in the country, it provides jobs for all those young people you've sent overseas to get trained. Because presently what they do is either they don't come back because there's nothing to do when they come back, or they come back and they become very embittered because they give them a make-work job where they're not using all the skills. It's like the old thing they used to talk about in the military. When they've been to Paris, you can't go back to the farm. Well, it's kind of the same thing. In this case, these individuals have been exposed to cutting-edge science and technology, and then they come back to a country that doesn't have the capabilities. So that's a wasted investment, but it's done for political reasons, to get the young people, very bright young people, out of the country for a few years, reduces the potential for instability in the country. And so for all of these countries, building a technology base would be very important in providing jobs for their people and making themselves competitive on the global marketplace.
That makes a lot of sense, because traditionally the Gulf states have been ones that have outsourced intelligence and human resources. So now that we see that there's a need for future survival with the oil crisis that's happening right there, they need to change what they're doing now to protect their future. And speaking of Saudi Arabia, in addition to monetary investments, Saudi Arabia has also offered future technological and strategic services to Virgin Galactic. For example, the potential designation of possible launch sites. What benefit does this have for Virgin Galactic, and what could this mean for traditional sites in the U.S.?
Well, for Virgin Galactic, the obvious one is it puts them close to the customer base. If people are going to buy suborbital flights, they had talked about this for a number of years now. They've talked about having a flight possibility in Sweden where you would launch people up and they would go over toward the North Pole and back, etc. Others have talked about doing Dubai as a potential place to have a spaceport where you would launch these suborbital flights. In all cases, those would be competitors directly with U.S. sites. And the one that's most obvious is New Mexico. New Mexico has built a spaceport. They basically did it because they assumed that the 2004 suborbital flights that won the prize would in fact mean that within 3 or 4 or 5 years they'd be flying out of New Mexico and it'd be a big boom. They spent $250 million, which that state didn't have, to do this. But what they've gotten out of it is nothing from their perspective compared to what they thought they were going to get, because there's not been any suborbital flights since then. Now, Virgin Galactic is talking about late this year, but probably realistically next year, they're going to start doing the test flights for Spaceship 2 and White Knight 2, which is the combination of vehicles that they use for their suborbital flights. They're talking about being ready to start those. Once they get those underway and they verify that they're safe, then the reality will be they will be able to open for business. Now, at one point, they had 250,000 people who said, I'm willing to spend $250,000 to fly on your vehicle. Whether those people are still available or not is unclear. And the reason is because the big push now is for space tourism is to actually go to orbit. There's a guy named Bigelow out of Nevada, Las Vegas, who built space habitats. One of those is presently attached to the International Space Station. What they're doing is they're testing it, because what it does is it goes to orbit and then you inflate it. You don't do all the construction that you had to do for the International Space Station, but it can give you additional space for storage, and people could live there potentially if you're able to outfit it. And if they're able to do that, what the theory is, they can put some, they've already got a couple in orbit that are being tested, and they've been there for a while, a couple of years. They're seeing how they're surviving the space environment, etc. Well, if they start being able to do that, I mean, you have space hotels, which is a biggie for space tourism, but it's also a biggie for space exploration, because it allows you to take along a collapsed space, get to the moon, and maybe inflate it as at least a temporary location where you can store supplies, or you can have people stay while others go to the lunar surface. If you're inside one of the spaceships like Dragon 1, if you had to spend 10 days in there, you go crazy, because you can't move around. They're not built for that. These are not luxury liners. And so Bigelow's habitats and others that will probably come online if his are successful provide an opportunity. And again, for the Arab states, it's an opportunity to become investors. It's an opportunity to start training people that they could work and fly to those locations, etc. But they wouldn't be building the rockets to do that. They would depend on others. They purchase rides. That's what NASA's going to be doing. If SpaceX and Boeing are successful with their human spaceflight vehicles, NASA will no longer fly to the International Space Station except in an emergency, and probably that would be unlikely because the space launch system they're building takes too long to cycle up. To do a rescue, or it'd have to be already on the pad. I mean, that was a problem with the Columbia disaster. even if we'd known that Columbia had been damaged during liftoff, we had no way to save them because there was no shuttle in a position that it could be cycled within the confines of what fuel they had and what oxygen they had. So they would have died in orbit, or they would have died during re-entry. They unfortunately didn't know, well, I guess maybe it was fortunate, they didn't know what was going to happen to them, and so they came down, and the Columbia basically disintegrated as the damage to the left front of the wing destroyed the vehicle and tore it apart. Very brutal, but the reality was there was no other alternative. They would have stayed in orbit and just been a ghost ship in effect.
Is there any possibility of the Florida launch sites becoming antiquated?
There's always that danger. That's why Space Florida has worked so hard not to do that. Because, for example, SpaceX is launching payloads and people, and with plans to launch crew off the Cape. But SpaceX is building a spaceport in Texas, and that's where I think they will eventually move their payload launches. They like it because they have total control over it. It's their spaceport. They have a variety of other things. The only difficulties they have is they're going to have to build a downrange thing so you have the ability to keep contact. Those are all doable things. So when the shuttle ended, the spaceport was in trouble. What's happening is Kennedy Space Center is shrinking, and most of it's being commercialized and leased to others. That's the hope, to keep the space people here. But if you'll notice, every time they talk about a new program coming to the Cape, there's not very many people being hired. We're talking about 600, 800, something like that. At the peak of the shuttle, it was 50,000 people. It's either in Florida and some other locations in California. We're all working on shuttle-related stuff.
And my last question, what role do you think Middle Eastern space agencies will play in the coming decades, and how will they differentiate themselves?
That's unclear. The biggest reason is because of all the instability right there. You know, we haven't talked about Iran. Iran is the one country, aside from Saudi Arabia, that can actually afford a space program. The difficulty is testing rockets for your space program is also testing missiles for your missile program. And so you get into some interesting discussions. The United States and others believe that each time the Iranians test a rocket they claim for their space program, they're saying, no, that's a missile test. So it's an unending kind of battle. So right now it's unclear. It's going to be that they will be in coalition with others. They'll be in alliances with others to do things. They weren't in the original International Space Station thing. If there's another space station built, whether it's commercial or governmental, I assume that all of the Gulf state space agencies will try to become involved. That's something they would never even thought about back when we started talking about a International Space Station or American Space Station back in 1984, when the president announced that that was a project, a program that he was supporting. And it took us many years, it took us 15 years to actually get the first pieces up to start, and then from there it took us another decade and a half to actually build out what we now call the International Space Station. The question will be whether the Gulf states will wait to see if something like that develops again, or will they go with the Chinese. The Chinese space station, as they just announced the other day, will in fact probably be the only space station in orbit by 2028. If they're talking now about extending the International Space Station to 2024, that assumes that the analysis of the structure is such that it will be safe to continue, and reasonably they think it will be. The problem then at 2024 is there's other countries that, like the Europeans, Japanese, who may wish to quit the International Space Station program, because they want to use their money that they're paying for other things. And so it may be that we'll be talking in 2024, 25 of deorbiting the International Space Station. Now the question is, we're not going to try and bring it down in one piece. In fact, the Russians are arguing that they'll take their piece out, which if they do, that was the first piece up, that would be basically destroy the space station in a sense, because it's the core of the space station. The problem is the Russians, it's not clear, have anywhere to go. They may join the Chinese, but they're going to be the second fiddle. And the present leadership in Russia doesn't hold that perception of themselves. They see themselves as first in line. So it'll be an interesting kind of struggle.
Thank you for your time, Dr. Handberg.
Welcome.